Get out of my house. I don't need a sick dad." The words hit me harder than the wind. Michael stood in the doorway, shoulders squared, jaw tight, blocking the light from the hallway behind him. Snow blew sideways past his legs and into the living room, like it was trying to follow me inside. I was 70 years old, leaning on my cane, my bad knee screaming, my right side still slower since the stroke. I opened my mouth to speak, but the sentence never made it out. He wasn't asking anything. He wasn't listening. Karen stood a step behind him, half hidden, her arms wrapped around herself. Earlier there had been tears. Now there were none. Her eyes didn't meet mine. They watched the floor. Or maybe they watched me the way you watch something you've already decided to throw away. The door slammed. The deadbolt slid home with a sharp metal click that cut through the storm. I stood there in the snow, stunned, my breath fogging the air, my heart pounding like it had missed a step. I patted my pockets with numb fingers. No phone, no coat. $40 folded in my wallet. That was it. I raised my hand and knocked once. Weak. Embarrassing. The lights inside went out one by one. 3 hours later, the hospital would call my son in horror. And everything he thought he knew would come apart. I stood on the porch longer than I should have, the cold seeping up through the soles of my shoes into my bones. Snow clung to my pant legs and melted, soaking the cuffs. The wind found every opening in my clothes, slid down my collar, pressed its icy fingers into the hollow at my throat. I told myself this was a misunderstanding. That any second the door would open again. That Michael would step back out angry but calmer and tell me to come inside. It didn't happen. The porch light flicked off. The house went dark. Through the front window I saw Karen's silhouette move once, then disappear down the hallway. I realized with a quiet certainty that settled in my chest that I was truly locked out. I tried to understand how we had gotten here. Just weeks earlier, this had been the place Michael insisted I come. "You shouldn't be alone, Dad. We'll take care of you." After the stroke, after the knee surgery, my world had shrunk. I moved slower. I forgot things. I hated needing help, hated feeling like an extra piece of furniture someone had to step around. When my wife died, the house felt too big, too quiet. When Michael offered, I believed him. I believed family meant safety. I remembered him standing in this same doorway months ago, holding my elbow, as I learned to walk without dragging my right foot. "I've got you, Dad," he said then. I believed him then too. The wind gusted harder, snapping me back to the present. I checked my wallet again, like money might have appeared out of nowhere. $40. No keys, that mattered. The phone was still charging on the nightstand in the room I would never sleep in again. I took one step off the porch and nearly slipped. The cane skidded on ice, and I had to catch myself against the railing. Pain shot through my knee, hot and sharp. I stood there, breathing hard, the storm roaring around me, and forced myself to think. I couldn't stay here. The temperature was dropping fast. The street was dark and quiet, the neighbors' windows black. Pride told me not to knock on their doors. Shame told me to disappear. Survival told me to move. There was a church about 3 miles away, down past the main road. I knew it because I'd passed it before, because I remembered seeing a sign about a cold weather shelter during the last bad winter. 3 miles felt impossible. Standing still felt worse. I turned my back on the house and started walking. The snow thickened as I reached the sidewalk, the flakes heavy and wet sticking to my eyelashes. Each step was an argument between my body and my will. The cane sank into the slush, slipped, found purchase again. My knee protested every movement. My right hand felt clumsy, slower to react like it always did now. I kept my eyes on the ground, measuring each step, afraid of falling, afraid of not being able to get back up. The neighborhood was silent. No cars, no voices, just the wind and the crunch of snow under my shoes. I passed the mailbox where I used to wait when Michael was a boy, watching for him to come home from school. I could see him in my mind, backpack bouncing, waving both arms, when he spotted me. Dad, look. I got an A. The memory hit me so hard, I had to stop, lean on my cane, and close my eyes. I didn't understand how that boy had grown into the man who shut a door in my face. I told myself to keep moving. I told myself I'd rest later. The cold had a way of sneaking up on you, of convincing you that stopping was a good idea. I knew enough to be afraid of that. I focused on putting one foot in front of the other, on the rhythm of my breath, on the dim glow of a streetlight ahead. As I left the residential blocks, the houses gave way to closed shops and dark windows. The wind funneled between buildings, stronger here, pushing me sideways. My hands began to tingle, then ache. I flexed my fingers, but they didn't move the way I expected them to. My thoughts slowed just a little, like they were wading through thick water. Cars passed on the main road, headlights slicing through the snow. None of them slowed. None of them stopped. I wondered what I looked like from behind those windshields. An old man with a cane, a problem. Something to avoid. I checked my wallet again, without meaning to. $40. I laughed once, a short, breathless sound that disappeared into the wind. It felt absurd, the way things always do, right before they become dangerous. The church steeple appeared faintly in the distance, a darker shape against the sky. It felt unreal, like something I was imagining to keep myself going. I counted my steps. I whispered my wife's name under my breath. Then my son's, like they were anchors that could keep me upright. My knee buckled just for a second, and pain flared so bright it stole my breath. I caught myself, heart racing, and stood there shaking. I knew then that I was closer to the edge than I wanted to admit. The cold wasn't just outside me anymore. It was inside, settling into my muscles, my thoughts, my resolve. I looked back once, though I knew better. The house was gone now, swallowed by the storm and the distance. There was nothing behind me but darkness. Ahead, the steeple seemed closer. Or maybe I just needed it to be. I took another step, then another. I didn't know yet how close I was to collapsing. I didn't know that people would use words like abuse and investigation and evidence to describe this night. All I knew was that I had been told to leave, and that leaving was killing me. I leaned into the wind and kept walking, telling myself just a little farther, not understanding that the night I thought was ending had only just begun. Before that night, before the snow and the locked door, I truly believed I was doing the right thing. After my wife passed, the silence in our house became a physical presence. It settled into the corners of the rooms, into the empty chair at the kitchen table, into the sound of my own footsteps echoing back at me. I told myself I was managing fine. I cooked simple meals. I watched the news. I took my medications on time, but after the stroke, managing became harder to pretend. My right side never quite listened to me the way it used to. Some mornings my hand shook when I tried to button my shirt. Some nights my knee throbbed so badly I slept in the recliner because climbing into bed felt like too much. I hated needing help. I hated the way people's voices changed when they talked to me, slower, louder, like age had stolen my ability to understand words. I hated the look in strangers' eyes when they noticed the cane. But what I hated most was the quiet fear that crept in late at night, the thought that if something went wrong, no one would know until it was too late. Michael started calling more often after my second fall. Not long calls, just enough to check in. "How you feeling, Dad? You eating okay? You sure you don't need anything?" His voice sounded concerned, almost protective. I didn't tell him how hard it was getting. I didn't tell him about the nights I sat awake listening to my own breathing, wondering if I'd wake up in the morning. I didn't want to be that father. It was Michael who suggested I move in with them. "Just for a while," he said. "Until you're stronger. Until the doctors clear you." Karen agrees. She thinks it makes sense. I remember the way he said her name like it was a guarantee. When Karen got on the phone, her voice was warm, almost cheerful. Of course, Dad. We have plenty of room. You shouldn't be alone right now. Family takes care of family. She said it easily, like something she'd practiced. I told her I didn't want to be a burden. She laughed softly and said, "You're not a burden, you're Michael's father." Those words mattered to me more than I realized at the time. I hesitated for weeks, making excuses, delaying. Pride is a stubborn thing, especially when it's all you feel you have left. But then there was another night when my knee gave out in the kitchen, and I sat on the floor for nearly an hour, unable to stand without pain shooting up my leg. That was the night I said yes. Their house sat in a quiet Oregon suburb, neat lawns, wide driveway, the kind of place that looked safe just by existing. When I arrived with my suitcase and my pill organizer and the few framed photos I couldn't leave behind, Karen greeted me at the door with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Michael hugged me, careful and brief, like he was afraid of hurting me. I told myself that was love. They showed me my room. It was the old guest room at the end of the hall, a little removed from the rest of the house. Karen apologized for the size, said they hadn't expected this arrangement, but they'd make it work. The bed was firm. The window faced the side yard. It felt temporary, which somehow made it easier to accept. At first, everything was polite. Karen cooked dinner and left a plate for me when my knee acted up. She reminded me about my medication, sometimes twice, sometimes with a tight smile, like she was checking off a task. Michael was busy with work, often gone early and back late, trusting that Karen had things under control. I noticed small things before I noticed the big ones. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Karen correcting me in front of Michael gently but firmly, like she was training a child. He didn't seem to notice, or maybe he didn't want to. I started eating my meals earlier than them. Karen said it was better for my digestion. Sometimes I ate alone in my room, the sounds of their laughter drifting down the hallway reminding me that I was a guest in what was supposed to be my family's home. I told myself this was normal, that I was being sensitive, that this was the price of needing help. There were moments when Karen's kindness felt performative. She'd ask loudly if I needed anything when Michael was around, then fall silent once he left the room. She liked to speak for me, answering questions before I could, explaining my limitations in a tone that sounded helpful but felt diminishing. I felt myself shrinking in response, choosing silence, because it was easier than correcting her. Michael traveled more for work that fall, days at a time. Karen ran the house completely when he was gone, setting schedules, deciding when meals happened, when lights went off. I adjusted without complaint. I told myself I was lucky to have a place to stay. One afternoon, Karen mentioned that space was getting tight. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She just sighed and said it was an adjustment having someone else in the house all the time. I apologized immediately, the words leaving my mouth before I thought about them. She nodded, satisfied, like that was the response she wanted. That was the first time I felt truly unwelcome. I started to notice the way Karen watched me. Not constantly, not obviously, just enough to make me aware of it. Her eyes lingered when I moved too slowly, when I reached for things, when I forgot a word mid-sentence. Once after I mentioned feeling dizzy from my medication, she tilted her head and said, "You should be careful. People misunderstand things all the time." I didn't know what she meant, and I didn't ask. Looking back, I can see the pattern forming, quiet and deliberate. But at the time, all I felt was gratitude tangled with discomfort. I had been taught my whole life that keeping the peace mattered, that speaking up only made things worse, that as a father my role was to sacrifice to absorb discomfort so my family didn't have to. So I stayed quiet. I stayed polite. I stayed grateful. The night of the storm, Karen insisted I eat earlier than usual. She brought my dinner into my room herself, set the tray down carefully, asked if I'd taken my pills. Her smile was back wide and practiced. I remember thinking she seemed nervous, glancing at her phone more than once. I assumed Michael must be running late. I thanked her. I always thanked her. As the medication made my eyelids heavy, I leaned back in the chair and let the television murmur fill the room. I didn't know that while I drifted toward sleep, something was being decided for me. I didn't know that my silence, my compliance, my trust were about to be used as weapons. All I knew was that I had believed a house was the same thing as a home, and that believing that would cost me far more than I ever imagined. Something shifted in the house a few days before the storm, and I couldn't put a name to it at the time. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of change you feel more than you see, like the air tightening before a headache. The hallways felt quieter. Karen's footsteps sounded different, sharper, more deliberate. I caught myself listening for her movements, the way you listen for weather. I told myself I was imagining it. After a stroke, you learn not to trust every thought. Confusion becomes something you fear, something you try to hide. I didn't want to accuse my own mind of failing, but I didn't want to accuse her either. So I watched, quietly. Karen's moods started to swing in ways I couldn't follow. One morning, she was cheerful, offering me coffee and asking about my knee. That afternoon, she snapped when I asked where the mail was, like I'd crossed a line I didn't know existed. Later, she apologized, blaming stress, blaming the weather, blaming anything but herself. I accepted it. I always accepted it. She began correcting me more often sometimes about things I was sure of. "You already ate," she said once, when I hadn't. "You told me you were fine," she said another time when I distinctly remembered saying the opposite. I laughed it off, told her my memory wasn't what it used to be. The relief on her face lingered longer than it should have. Michael was gone more that week, traveling for work. When he was home, Karen was attentive, affectionate even. She touched his arm when she spoke, leaned into him, spoke softly. When he left the room, her voice flattened, the warmth draining out of it like water from a sink. The contrast unsettled me more than outright cruelty would have. I spent more time in my room, partly to stay out of the way, partly because it felt safer. The television filled the silence. The routine kept me steady. Pills at the same time every day. Meals when they were brought. I tried not to notice how often Karen checked her phone, how she sometimes watched me like she was waiting for something. The day of the storm arrived with warnings on every channel. Snow piling up, roads closing, stay indoors unless absolutely necessary. Karen mentioned it twice, once while passing my door, once while setting a blanket over the back of a chair. Michael texted to say he'd be late. Traffic, meetings. I pictured him driving home through the snow, tired, eager to be done with the day. Karen insisted I eat early. She said the weather might make things unpredictable later. She brought the tray herself, set it down carefully, and stood there a moment too long. I thanked her. She smiled, nodded, and left without another word. The medication made me drowsy. I remember leaning back in the chair, the glow of the screen softening my thoughts, drifting. I didn't leave the room again. I'm certain of that. My knee wouldn't have allowed it, and even if it had, I had no reason to wander. I stayed where I was, half awake, half asleep, unaware that time was narrowing around me. Later I would learn there were 7 minutes that mattered. 7 minutes when I was alone, sedated, harmless. 7 minutes when I wasn't watching. I didn't hear Karen move through the house then. I didn't see her in the mirror, down the hall, adjusting her hair, steadying her breathing. I didn't see her lift her phone switch to the front-facing camera and study her own reflection, like an actress checking her mark. I didn't hear the fabric tear the sharp inhale she practiced until it sounded real. What I remember is the sound of Michael's car pulling into the driveway. The engine cut. The door slammed. Footsteps hurried up the walk. I pushed myself upright, confusion flooding back into my body like cold water. My knee protested as I stood. My head felt thick, heavy. I opened my door just as Michael stepped inside. Karen's transformation was instant. Her shoulders slumped. Her voice rose shaky, breathless. She clung to him like she needed support to stand. I heard my name spoken with fear wrapped around it. but not the words themselves. My mind lagged behind the moment. I stepped into the hallway leaning on my cane and saw Michael's face. It was already set, already changed. His eyes flicked to me and then away, like looking at something dangerous. Karen was crying now, real tears spilling over her sleeve tugged back just enough to reveal a darkening mark on her arm. I didn't understand what I was seeing. My mouth opened, but again the words came too slowly. I felt like I was walking into a scene that had started without me, a story already being told in a language I didn't speak. Michael turned fully toward me then, and the look on his face stopped me cold. It wasn't anger yet. It was something worse. It was certainty. In that moment, I realized how completely I had underestimated what silence can do. I had believed staying quiet kept people safe. I had believed trust was a shield. Standing there watching my son hold his wife, while she pointed at me with shaking hands, I understood how wrong I had been. I had walked into a lie that didn't need my participation to destroy me. "What did you do to her?" Michael didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice was low and tight, each word pressed flat by something heavy behind it. Karen stood beside him, one hand gripping his sleeve, the other pulled in toward her chest like she was trying to protect herself from me. The hallway light caught the mark on her arm, already turning a deep, angry purple. Her shirt hung crooked, one shoulder seam torn just enough to look violent. I stared at them, my mind scrambling to catch up. "I don't understand," I said. The words came out thin, unsteady. "I was in my room. I didn't..." "Don't," Michael snapped. He finally looked at me, then really looked, and there was no warmth left in his eyes. "Don't lie to me." Karen let out a small broken sound, burying her face against his chest. I didn't want to say anything, she whispered. I didn't want to tear the family apart. But I was scared. I still am. The way she said it was careful, not specific. Fear without details. It landed exactly where it was meant to. I took a step forward without thinking, my knee flaring in protest. "Michael, listen to me. I was asleep. You know my medication. You know I can barely..." "Stay where you are," he said sharply. His hand came out palm raised like I was an animal that might lunge. The gesture stunned me more than the words. I froze. The cane trembled in my grip. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears, my thoughts scattering. Karen peeked at me through her fingers and flinched just enough. Michael noticed. He always noticed her. "You see," she said softly. "That look. That's what I mean." I followed his gaze to her arm, to the bruising skin. It didn't make sense. It couldn't. "That's not from me," I said. "You know my right hand barely closes. Ask the doctor, ask anyone. Check the cameras." The word cameras did something to her. Not much, just a flicker. She pressed closer to Michael. "They're gone," she said quickly. "The footage." I tried to look. I must have deleted it by accident. Michael didn't question it. He didn't ask how, he didn't ask when, he didn't move to check. He just nodded once, like that settled it. The air left my lungs. "I didn't do this," I said again, louder now, desperation creeping in despite my effort to keep it out. "I would never hurt her." "I raised you better than that." Michael's jaw tightened. "I brought you into my home," he said. "I trusted you. She trusted you." The word trusted felt like a knife. He stepped toward me, then faster than I expected. His hand closed around my arm just above the elbow. The grip was hard fingers digging in. Pain shot up my arm, sharp and immediate. I gasped, more from shock than pain. "Let go," I said. Karen made a sound behind him, small and frightened. "Michael, please." He didn't loosen his grip. He tightened it. "Don't touch her again," he said. "Do you understand me?" Something in my chest broke open then, not loudly, but completely. This was my son. The boy I'd carried on my shoulders. The man I'd stayed up nights worrying about. and he was holding me like I was dangerous. I didn't touch her, I said, my voice shaking now despite my effort to keep it steady. You're being lied to. That was the wrong thing to say. Michael shoved me backward, not hard enough to throw me to the ground, but hard enough that my knee buckled. I caught myself against the wall, my cane clattering to the floor. Pain flared white-hot through my leg. I bit back a cry more ashamed than hurt. Get out, he said. I looked at him, certain I'd misheard. What? Get out of my house, he repeated. I don't need a sick dad who can't control himself. The words landed heavy and final. Karen went quiet. She didn't protest. She didn't tell him to calm down. She just watched. I need my phone, I said, and my coat. It's snowing. Michael turned, grabbed my wallet from the table and tossed it at me. It hit my chest and fell to the floor. You have money, he said. You'll figure it out. I bent to pick it up, my fingers clumsy, my balance unsteady. My phone was still on the nightstand. My coat hung by the door. I reached for it. Michael stepped between me and the hook. No. Michael, I said, my voice breaking now, the dignity I'd tried to hold on to slipping away. I'm your father. He didn't answer. He grabbed my arm again, dragged me toward the door. The cold rushed in the moment he opened it, snow swirling at our feet. He pushed me out onto the porch without ceremony. I stumbled, barely catching myself on the railing. The door slammed shut behind me. The deadbolt clicked. I stood there, stunned, the wind, howling snow already soaking my clothes. I raised my hand and knocked once softly, humiliatingly. There was no answer. The porch light flicked off. Inside, I heard footsteps retreating, the sound of a television turning on normal life, resuming without me. I sank down onto the porch chair, my breath coming in ragged bursts. My arm throbbed where Michael had grabbed me. My knee burned. My chest felt hollow, like something essential had been scooped out and left behind. I thought of Michael as a child, standing in this same driveway, waiting for me to come home from work. I thought of the nights I'd stayed up with him when he was sick, the mornings I'd driven him to school in the snow. I thought of all the times I'd chosen silence over conflict, believing it was love. I pushed myself to my feet. The storm showed no sign of easing. Snow coated the steps, the railings, my shoes. I checked my pockets again uselessly. $40, no phone, no coat. Staying here meant freezing. Going back inside was no longer an option. As I stepped off the porch and into the night, one clear thought cut through the fog of pain and disbelief. I could die out here. And the people who should have protected me were the ones who put me in the storm. The wind took control the moment I stepped off the porch. It pushed against my chest like a living thing, stealing my breath, forcing me to lean forward just to stay upright. Snow flew sideways, sharp and wet, stinging my face, clinging to my eyelashes until the world blurred. The house behind me vanished almost immediately, swallowed by darkness and white noise, as if it had never been there at all. I paused at the edge of the walkway, my cane sinking into slush, and waited for my heart to slow. It didn't. It hammered in my chest, uneven and loud, each beat reminding me how fragile my body had become. I told myself to stay calm, to think clearly, but fear crept in anyway, quiet and insistent. This isn't real, I thought. This can't be how it ends. I took my first step onto the sidewalk and nearly fell. The cane skidded on ice, my knee buckled, and pain flared up my leg so fast it made my vision dim. I grabbed a snow-dusted mailbox to steady myself, breathing hard, my fingers already stiffening in the cold. The metal burned my skin through my gloves. I hadn't gone 20 feet, and my body was already protesting. The street was empty. No cars, no lights in the houses lining the block. Curtains drawn, windows dark. The kind of quiet that makes you feel small and insignificant, like the world wouldn't notice if you disappeared into it. I forced myself to move again. Each step was deliberate, measured. Cane first, left foot, right foot. Pause, repeat. Snow soaked through my shoes almost immediately, turning my socks heavy and cold. The wet crept up around my ankles, numbing them, dulling sensation, until my feet felt like they belonged to someone else. I told myself not to stop. I knew what stopping could mean. I'd lived long enough to know that cold didn't just make you uncomfortable. It made you careless. It made you tired. It whispered that sitting down was reasonable, that resting for just a minute wouldn't hurt. I couldn't afford to listen. The houses blurred together as I passed them, each one a reminder of what I didn't have: warmth, light, a door that would open if I knocked. I imagined ringing a bell, explaining myself, asking for help. The image filled me with shame so sharp it hurt worse than the cold. I was someone's father. I had been independent my whole life. Begging on a snowy sidewalk felt like a final humiliation I wasn't ready to accept, so I kept walking. My breath came out in short, visible bursts, fogging the air in front of me. The wind found every weakness in my clothing, slipped through seams, pressed icy fingers into my collar down my back. My hands began to ache, then tingle, the sensation strange and distant. I flexed my fingers around the cane, willing them to keep working. I passed the corner where I used to stand when Michael was a boy, waiting for the school bus to drop him off. I could see him in my mind, backpack too big for his shoulders, running toward me, snow crunching under his sneakers. "Dad," he'd shout, waving like I might miss him. The memory hit me so hard I had to stop. I leaned on my cane chest, heaving tears burning in my eyes, only to freeze against my lashes. How did we get here? How did that child become the man who shoved me into a storm and locked the door? There were no answers in the snow. I started walking again, slower now. My knee throbbed with each step, a deep grinding pain that radiated up into my hip. The stroke had left my right side weaker, slower to respond, and the cold made it worse. My leg dragged slightly, the motion uneven, exhausting. I felt old in a way I never had before, stripped down to the limits of my body. Cars appeared on the main road ahead, headlights cutting through the snowfall in bright, indifferent lines. They passed without slowing, tires hissing against wet pavement. I wondered if any of the drivers saw me, an old man hunched against the storm, or if I blended into the night like another piece of debris. I checked my wallet again without thinking, fingers clumsy, movements slow. $40. The number meant nothing and everything at once. Enough to remind me how alone I was. Not enough to fix anything. The cold crept higher, settling into my calves, my knees, my hands. My thoughts began to feel heavier, like they had to push through something thick just to form. I shook my head, trying to clear it, focusing on the sound of my breathing, on the rhythm of my steps. I remembered the church. It sat a few miles down the road, a squat brick building with a small steeple and a sign out front that changed with the seasons. I'd seen it lit up during winter storms, before people coming and going, volunteers setting up cots. The memory felt fragile, uncertain, but it was something, a direction, a reason to keep moving. 3 miles sounded impossible. Standing still sounded worse. I told myself I would make it to the next streetlight, then the next. I broke the distance down into pieces, small enough to manage lying to myself, just enough to keep going. The wind picked up as I left the neighborhood, funneled between buildings, stronger and colder. Snow plastered itself against my face, my coat, my pants. My hands stopped hurting and started to feel numb, which frightened me more than the pain had. I slapped them lightly against my thighs, desperate to feel something. Time lost its shape. I couldn't tell how long I'd been walking. My watch was still inside the house. My phone was uselessly warm on the nightstand where I'd left it. The world narrowed to what was directly in front of me, white ground, dark shapes the next step. My thoughts drifted in strange directions. I wondered if Michael would regret it. If Karen was warm sitting on the couch telling him she was okay now, I wondered if anyone would notice I was gone before morning. The idea that I might simply vanish settled in my chest like a weight. I felt invisible. The church steeple appeared faintly through the snow, just a darker outline against the sky. Relief surged through me, sudden and dizzying. I laughed, a weak, breathless sound that was almost a sob. I wasn't imagining it. It was real. My knee gave out without warning. Pain exploded through my leg, white and blinding, and I pitched forward, barely catching myself on my cane before I went down. I stood there, shaking, heart-racing tears freezing on my cheeks. The church was close now. I could see the edge of the parking lot, the faint glow of a light near the door. I whispered to myself, just a little farther. My leg trembled with every step. My balance felt wrong off by inches I couldn't correct in time. The cold had dulled my reflexes, slowed my reactions. Each movement took more effort than the last. I knew then that I was in real danger. I kept going anyway, leaning into the wind, into the pain, into the fear. Because stopping meant giving up. And after everything that had been taken from me that night, I wasn't ready to give up the one thing I still had. My life. The church was close enough now that I could see the shape of it through the snow, the squat outline of brick and the narrow steeple rising like a finger pointing upward. A single light glowed near the side entrance, hazy and distant, but real. For the first time since I'd been shoved out into the storm, I felt something like hope. I told myself that making it this far meant I would survive. The parking lot was a sheet of ice covered in powdery snow, the lines long buried. My cane slipped as soon as I stepped onto it, the rubber tips skidding sideways. I adjusted my grip and moved slower, my breath coming out in short, sharp gasps that burned my throat. The wind cut across the open space without mercy, slamming into me, stealing heat faster than I could generate it. My legs trembled uncontrollably now. Not from fear, but from exhaustion and cold. Each step felt disconnected from my thoughts, like my body was running on a delay. I focused on the door, on the idea of warmth just beyond it. I pictured myself sitting inside, wrapped in a blanket, someone handing me a cup of something hot. I clung to that image the way a drowning man clings to driftwood. Halfway across the lot, my coordination started to unravel. My foot landed where I didn't expect it to. My cane slipped again. I overcorrected my knee, screaming in protest. Pain shot through my legs, sharp and immediate, but it barely registered. Something else was happening. Something worse. My thoughts felt slow, heavy. The world narrowed at the edges, my vision tunneling until all I could see was the light near the door. I dropped my cane. It hit the ice with a dull clatter that sounded far away. I stared at it for a moment, confused as if it belonged to someone else. Bending to pick it up felt like an impossible task. My fingers didn't respond the way I told them to. When I finally grasped the handle, my grip was weak, unreliable. I took another step, then another. My knee gave out completely. There was no warning this time. No sharp flare of pain, just a sudden absence of support. My leg folded beneath me and I went down hard onto the ice. The impact knocked the breath from my lungs in a soundless rush. For a moment I lay there staring up at the sky, snowflakes landing on my face, melting against my skin and refreezing. I tried to get up. My arms shook as I pushed against the ground, my palms numb, my elbows refusing to lock. My leg wouldn't respond at all. It felt heavy, useless, like it had been unplugged from the rest of me. Panic surged through me, then hot and sharp, cutting through the fog. Get up, I told myself. You have to get up. I tried again, gritting my teeth, my breath coming in ragged bursts. My body sagged back down, defeated. The effort left me dizzy, my head spinning. I lay there, chest heaving, snow already collecting on my coat, seeping into the fabric, stealing what little warmth I had left. Time began to slip. Minutes stretched and compressed, losing their shape. I wasn't sure how long I lay there, only that the cold kept creeping deeper, settling into my muscles, my bones. My hands felt strangely detached, like they weren't part of me anymore. When I tried to curl my fingers, nothing happened. I tried to call out. The sound that left my mouth was barely a whisper, thin and weak, swallowed immediately by the wind. I tried again, louder this time, but it came out the same. My voice didn't belong to me anymore. Snow piled up on my sleeves, my chest, my legs. I watched it with distant curiosity, the way you might watch something happening to someone else. My thoughts drifted in fragments. Faces, places, half-formed memories that slipped away as soon as I reached for them. One clear thought cut through the fog, sharp and painful. Michael will never know the truth. The realization hit me harder than the cold. Not fear, not anger, just a deep, hollow sadness that settled in my chest. I pictured my son's face, the certainty in his eyes as he told me to get out. I wondered if that would be the last image he had of me. His sick father, a problem removed. I thought of my wife then, her voice calm and steady, the way she used to tell me to sit down and breathe when things felt overwhelming. I imagined her hand on my shoulder, firm and reassuring. The image brought a strange sense of peace, as if I wasn't entirely alone after all. The cold wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. My shivering slowed, then stopped, which I knew was bad, very bad. My thoughts grew softer, less urgent. The idea of closing my eyes felt comforting, inviting. I fought it. I forced myself to stay awake by counting my breaths, by repeating names under my breath, by focusing on the light near the church door. It seemed farther away now, dimmer, like it was retreating from me. Then I heard something. At first I thought it was another trick of my mind, the wind playing games. But the sound came again, clearer this time. A door opening. Footsteps crunching on snow. A voice calling out, uncertain, searching. "Sir," I tried to answer. My lips moved, but no sound came out. Panic flared again, brief and sharp, before my energy drained away. The footsteps came closer. A shape loomed over me, blocking the light. And then there were hands on my shoulders, firm and warm, even through the layers of clothing. "Oh my God," someone said. "Stay with me. Don't move." A coat was draped over me, heavy and warm, the sudden contrast almost painful. I felt myself being touched, assessed, spoken to, but it all felt distant, muffled. I tried to focus on the face above me, on the concern in their eyes, but my vision wouldn't cooperate. Sirens wailed in the distance. Red and blue lights flashed against the snow, surreal and bright. I was lifted onto something solid, strapped down gently but firmly. An oxygen mask pressed against my face, cool air flooding my lungs. Breathing became easier. The effort lessened, though my body still felt unbearably heavy. Voices surrounded me, professional, urgent. 70 years old, severe cold exposure. How long was he out here? I don't know. Found him near the lot. I wanted to tell them. I wanted to explain. But my mouth wouldn't work, my tongue thick and uncooperative. The world tilted and swayed as they loaded me into the ambulance. The doors slammed shut, cutting off the wind, the storm, the night. Warmth began to seep back into me, painful and tingling like needles under my skin. I groaned, the sound surprising me with its volume. Someone spoke softly, reassuringly, telling me I was going to be okay. As the ambulance pulled away, I drifted in and out of awareness, catching fragments of conversation between the paramedics. Thrown out in this weather, yeah. No coat, no phone. That's not right. Another voice, lower, serious. This could be elder abuse. The words floated through my foggy mind, strange and unreal. Abuse. Investigation. I didn't understand them yet. All I knew was that I was alive, that someone had found me, and that the night I thought might end me had not finished telling its story. The last thing I remember before the darkness closed in was the steady beep of a monitor and the faint, undeniable sense that the truth was no longer something I could protect by staying silent. I woke to a sound that didn't belong to the storm. It was steady, rhythmic, insistent. A soft electronic pulse like a metronome, keeping time inside my chest. My eyes opened slowly, lids heavy, reluctant, and the ceiling above me came into focus in pieces. White tiles, fluorescent light, a faint reflection of myself in polished metal. The air smelled clean and sharp, nothing like snow. For a moment I thought I was back in the hospital after my stroke. The same bed, The same quiet urgency. The same sense that my body had betrayed me while the world kept moving. Then the memories came back in a rush. The door. Michael's face. The storm. The ice. The light at the church. I tried to move and felt pain everywhere at once. My knee throbbed like a drumbeat, my arms ached. My chest felt tight sore with each breath. A thin plastic tube rested under my nose, cool air flowing gently into my lungs. I swallowed and winced, my throat dry and raw. A nurse noticed my movement almost immediately. She stepped into my line of sight, calm and efficient, her voice low and steady. "You're in the hospital," she said. "You're safe. Try not to move too much." Safe. The word felt strange in my mouth, even unspoken. She checked the monitor, adjusted something at my bedside, and asked me a series of questions. My name, my age. Did I know where I was? Each answer took effort, but they came out right. She nodded, satisfied, and smiled at me in a way that was kind, without being pitying. "You were lucky," she said. "Another hour out there, and it could have been very different." Lucky wasn't the word I would have chosen. Alive, maybe. Unfinished. As she helped me sip water, I noticed the bruises on my arm. Dark, uneven marks blooming against my skin, already tender to the touch. Finger-shaped. I stared at them longer than I meant to. They were real. Undeniable. Evidence written directly onto my body. I thought of the mark I'd seen on Karen's arm and felt something twist in my chest. Later, a doctor came in and explained what had happened in careful, measured language. Hypothermia. Cold exposure. My knee injury, aggravated by the fall. He spoke about risks and recovery and monitoring, his voice professional practiced. I listened, nodded, asked a question or two, but my mind kept circling back to one thing. How did they find me? A woman with short gray hair and a clipboard answered that question when she introduced herself as the hospital's social worker. She pulled a chair close to my bed and sat down like she had all the time in the world. She asked me how I was feeling, not just physically, but overall. The question caught me off guard. I told her the truth. I was tired, confused, embarrassed. She nodded, making a note. "Can you tell me why you were outside in that storm?" she asked gently. The words hung between us. I hesitated. Old habits are hard to break. My first instinct was to minimize, to smooth things over, to protect my son. "There was a misunderstanding," I said. "Family trouble. It wasn't anyone's fault." She didn't argue. She didn't interrupt. She just waited. The silence did something to me. It made lying feel heavier than telling the truth. "My son lives nearby," I said slowly. "I was staying with him and his wife. There was an argument. He told me to leave." Her pen paused. "Did you leave on your own?" I swallowed. He pushed me out. Locked the door. "Did you have a coat?" she asked. "No." "A phone, no." She looked up at me, then her expression unchanged, but sharper somehow, more focused. "Mr. Ward," she said, "how old are you?" 70. "And you have a history of medical issues?" "Yes." She set the clipboard aside. "I need to be very clear with you. Being forced out of a home into severe weather without basic protection, especially given your age and health, is very serious." I felt a flicker of unease. "I don't want Michael in trouble," I said quickly. He was upset. "He didn't mean for—" She held up a hand, stopping me gently. "Intent and outcome aren't the same thing," she said. "What happened to you could have killed you." The words landed hard. She said the phrase, then calmly, without drama. "This may be considered elder abuse." I shook my head immediately. "No," I said. "He's my son. He wouldn't hurt me. He was lied to. He didn't know what he was doing." Her eyes softened, but her voice stayed firm. "I understand you want to protect him. That's very common. But my responsibility is to your safety." I felt something shift inside me. The idea that this wasn't just a family argument, that it had a name, a legal one, a dangerous one. She explained mandatory reporting in clear, straightforward terms. The hospital was required to notify authorities when a vulnerable adult was harmed or placed at serious risk. It wasn't optional. It wasn't personal. It was policy. I felt exposed, stripped of control. My first instinct was to refuse to insist it wasn't necessary. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself staring at the ceiling, listening to the monitor beep, steadily marking time I almost hadn't had. "What happens now?" I asked. "Adult Protective Services will follow up," she said. "They'll speak with you. They may speak with your son. They'll look at the circumstances." I imagined Michael getting that call, his confusion, his anger, his certainty cracking under the weight of questions he hadn't asked before. The thought hurt more than the bruises. "I don't want revenge," I said quietly. She met my gaze. "This isn't about revenge," she said. "It's about truth and safety." After she left, I lay there alone, the room humming softly around me. Machines breathed and beeped. Somewhere down the hall, a cart rattled. Life continued indifferent to the storm that had nearly ended mine. I thought about how easily I'd accepted being blamed, how quickly I'd stepped into silence, believing it would protect everyone. I thought about how close that silence had come to killing me. For the first time since Michael shoved me out into the cold, I felt something other than shock or grief. I felt resolve. If the truth was coming, I wouldn't stand in its way anymore. The woman from Adult Protective Services arrived the next morning just after the nurse helped me sit up and replace the warm blankets around my legs. She didn't look the way I expected. No stern expression, no clipboard clutched like a shield. She was calm, composed, dressed plainly with eyes that missed very little. She introduced herself by her first name and asked if it was a good time to talk, as if I had a real choice. Her tone carried something I hadn't felt in days. Respect. She pulled a chair close to my bed and sat at eye level, not looming, not distant. "I'm here to understand what happened," she said. "Nothing more, nothing less." I nodded. My throat tightened anyway. She asked me to start from the beginning. Not the storm, not the hospital, the beginning. So I told her. I told her about my wife's death, about the stroke, the knee surgery, the fear of being alone. I told her about Michael's offer and Karen's voice on the phone, warm and reassuring. I described the house, the guest room, the way I learned to make myself smaller without realizing I was doing it. She listened without interruption, occasionally asking a quiet question. How long had I lived there? Did I have my own key? Who controlled my medications? Each question felt precise, deliberate, like she was assembling a picture piece by piece. When I reached the night of the storm, my voice faltered. Not because I was afraid anymore, but because saying it out loud made it real, in a way silence never had. "He accused me," I said. Didn't ask. Didn't check anything. He just believed her. She nodded slowly. "What did she say you did?" I explained the accusation, choosing my words carefully. The investigator didn't react. She didn't gasp or frown. She simply wrote it down. "Were you physically capable of doing what she claimed?" she asked. I shook my head. "No. I use a cane. My right side is weak. I can barely grip a coffee mug some days." She looked at me closely, then, not skeptically, but thoughtfully. "Have you signed releases for your medical records?" "Yes," I said, "yesterday." "Good," she replied. "That helps." She requested copies of my charts, the reports from my neurologist, the notes from my orthopedic surgeon. She reviewed them there quietly, occasionally asking me to clarify something. Grip strength, balance issues, medication side effects. The more she read, the calmer she became. At one point, she set the papers down and met my eyes. "Based on your documented limitations," she said evenly, "the actions described in the accusation would be extremely unlikely." Something in my chest loosened. I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been holding myself together until that moment. Being believed wasn't a rush of relief. It was heavier than that. It was like setting down a weight I hadn't admitted I was carrying. She asked about bruises. I showed her my arm. She examined the marks gently, professionally. These, she said, are consistent with force applied from the front gripping, not self-inflicted. I didn't comment. I didn't need to. Then she asked about the house. Are there security cameras, she said. Yes, I replied. Michael installed them last year, for safety. Do you know where they're located? I described them as best I could. Front door, back patio, hallway leading toward the bedrooms. What did your daughter-in-law say about the footage, she asked. She said it was deleted, I said. By accident. The investigator's pen paused for just a fraction of a second. Deleted doesn't always mean destroyed, she said. Many systems store data remotely. I felt a subtle shift in the room, like the air changing pressure before a storm. She explained how cloud backups worked, how timestamps couldn't be altered without leaving traces. She didn't promise anything. She didn't speculate. She simply stated facts. Would you consent to us requesting access to the system, she asked. Yes, I said immediately. The word came out stronger than I expected. As she gathered her things, she asked one final question. Is there anything else you think we should know? I thought of Karen's glances, her phone, the way she'd spoken about misunderstandings. I thought of how carefully she'd avoided details. I don't know what she was planning, I said honestly. I just know it wasn't an accident. The investigator nodded. That's enough for now. After she left, the room felt quieter, but not emptier. The nurse came and went. The doctor checked in briefly. Time passed in slow, steady increments. For the first time since the storm, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't bracing for blame. I was waiting for facts. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed on the bedside table. A text from an unknown number. I didn't open it right away. My heart rate picked up the monitor, reacting before I could stop it. When I finally looked, it was a short message. Dad, please call me. Michael. I stared at the screen for a long time. My first instinct was to respond, to explain, to ease his discomfort the way I always had. The second instinct, quieter but stronger, told me to wait. I set the phone face down. That evening, the investigator called again. Her voice was measured, but there was an edge to it now. Momentum. We've contacted your son, she said. He's cooperating. I closed my eyes briefly. Has he seen the footage, I asked. Not yet, she replied. We're in the process of securing it. She explained the steps, the requests, the permissions. Each word felt like another brick being laid steady and unavoidable. After the call ended, I lay back against the pillows and stared at the ceiling. The beeping of the monitor was familiar now, almost comforting. My body still ached. My knee throbbed. My arm was bruised and tender. But beneath the pain was something new. Stillness. For the first time since Karen's accusation, I didn't feel the need to defend myself. I didn't feel the urge to rehearse explanations or apologies. I had told the truth. My body had told the truth. Everything else would follow in its own time. Silence had nearly killed me. This time I would let the evidence speak. Waiting turned out to be harder than walking through the storm. I had been discharged from the hospital that morning, cleared to leave with strict instructions and a knee brace that made every step feel deliberate. A temporary room had been arranged for me nearby, quiet and plain, the kind of place meant for recovery rather than comfort. My phone sat on the small table beside the bed, face up, screen dark. Every few minutes I glanced at it, then looked away, as if staring might force it to ring. For most of my life, I had been the one who waited calmly while others panicked. Now, the roles were reversed. The truth was moving without me, and all I could do was stay out of its way. I made coffee with shaking hands and sat by the window watching the snow finally ease. The storm that had nearly killed me was breaking apart, leaving behind gray slush and silence. It felt symbolic in a way I didn't fully trust. Nothing else in my life had resolved that neatly. When the phone finally rang, I didn't answer right away. I let it ring twice, 3 times, steadying my breathing. Then I picked it up. "This is Elias," I said. "It's me," the investigator replied. Her voice was calm, professional, but there was something new beneath it. "Focus, momentum. I wanted to update you." I closed my eyes. "Okay, we've gained access to the security system at your son's house," she said. He provided the credentials himself. That detail landed heavier than I expected. Michael had cooperated, not argued, not delayed. A part of him at least wanted to know. "The system stores footage in the cloud," she continued. "Deletion from the device doesn't remove archived data." I thought of Karen's confidence when she'd said it was gone. How quickly she'd dismissed the idea that proof could exist. I said nothing. "We reviewed the footage from the night of the incident," the investigator said. "From multiple cameras." My grip tightened on the phone. And she didn't rush. "The footage shows you entering your room at 6:42 in the evening. You remain seated there. You do not leave." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "The timestamps are clear," she went on. "The camera in the hallway shows your door closed. No movement, no interaction." I pictured myself in that chair, half asleep, unaware. The ordinariness of it made my chest ache. Approximately 7 minutes later, she said, "Your daughter-in-law appears on camera alone." My stomach turned. "She goes into the hallway bathroom." The investigator continued, her voice steady. "The camera angle doesn't show everything but enough." I didn't interrupt. "She is seen looking directly into the mirror. She uses her phone's front-facing camera. She applies makeup to her arm, darkens an area of skin, presses repeatedly until the color deepens." My fingers went numb. "There is no sign of distress," the investigator said. "No shaking, no panic. She appears composed, focused." I stared at the wall in front of me, the paint peeling slightly near the corner. "What about the tear in her shirt?" I asked quietly. "She pulls at the fabric deliberately," the investigator replied. "Adjusts it. Practices crying, several times." The room felt too small, too close. I could almost see it, Karen standing there, rehearsing, choosing her angles, timing her performance. "When your son arrives home," the investigator said, her demeanor changes immediately. I swallowed. "He saw this?" "Yes," she said. "We showed him." The word "showed" echoed in my head. Shown, not told, not argued. Shown. There was a pause on the line. I could hear the faint hum of office noise on her end, keyboards, distant voices. Life going on. "How did he react?" I asked. The investigator chose her words carefully. He was silent at first, then visibly shaken. He asked to watch it again. I closed my eyes. The image of Michael watching the footage, watching his wife construct a lie frame by frame, cut deeper than any accusation. "He said he didn't understand," she continued. "He said he should have checked. He should have listened." I nodded, though she couldn't see it. It was too late for shoulds. "There's more," she said. Of course there was. As we continued reviewing data, the investigator explained we found additional inconsistencies. Phone records, messages sent and deleted around the same time frame, financial inquiries. My heart sank. What kind of inquiries? "Research related to elder abuse claims," she said. "Compensation, legal thresholds." The words settled heavily in my chest. This hadn't been impulsive. It hadn't been a moment of fear or confusion. It had been planned. "She was looking for a way to remove you from the household," the investigator said. "Permanently." I felt cold all over again, a different kind of cold one that had nothing to do with weather. I thought of the nights I'd apologized for existing, the way I'd tried to make myself smaller, the way I'd trusted her. "Are there going to be charges?" I asked. "Yes," she said. "False reporting at minimum. Potential fraud-related charges as well." I leaned back in the chair, exhaustion washing over me. Not relief, not satisfaction, just a deep, bone-tired acceptance. After we ended the call, I sat there for a long time, phone resting in my lap, the room quiet around me. The truth had arrived exactly as it was supposed to, without shouting, without theatrics. Just facts lined up one after another, impossible to ignore. My phone buzzed again. A text this time. "Dad. Please, I saw it. I'm so sorry." I read the message once. Then again. The apology felt real, raw. It also felt insufficient. I didn't respond. An hour later, another message came through. "I should have protected you. I failed you." That one hurt more. I imagined Michael alone in the house, the same house that had turned into a courtroom, a crime scene, a lie exposed by its own arrogance. I imagined Karen realizing the footage existed, realizing her certainty had been misplaced. I felt no urge to confront her, no desire to see her face. The lie hadn't just failed, it had unraveled. I stood slowly, testing my knee, and walked to the window. Outside, the snow had stopped completely. People were clearing driveways, scraping ice, resuming normal routines. The world didn't know what had happened inside that house. It didn't need to. What mattered was this. I had not imagined it. I had not exaggerated. I had not been confused or dangerous or wrong. I had been lied about. And the truth, once uncovered, required no performance at all. Once the lie cracked, everything underneath it began to show. The investigator called again the following afternoon. Her voice was the same calm register I had come to recognize, but there was a difference now, a weight to it. Momentum had turned into direction. "We've continued reviewing records connected to your daughter-in-law," she said. "There are additional concerns." I sat at the small table in my temporary room. My knee braced a cup of untouched coffee cooling beside me. "What kind of concerns?" I asked, though part of me already knew. "Financial," she said, "and personal." She explained it slowly, carefully, the way professionals do when they know each word carries consequences. Karen had been researching elder abuse claims months before the storm. Not casually, repeatedly. Compensation amounts, legal timelines, what constituted neglect, what qualified as proof. She had searched for phrases like removal from unsafe environment and emergency protective orders. I closed my eyes. I thought of the times she'd asked about my insurance, the nights she'd casually brought up paperwork, medical bills, the cost of care. I had assumed it was concern. I had wanted it to be. She also contacted a legal consultation service, the investigator continued, under an alias. The room felt suddenly too quiet for what I asked. To ask what would happen if an elderly resident posed a threat to the household, she said, and what options existed for immediate removal. There it was. I wasn't just inconvenient. I wasn't just unwanted. I was an obstacle. The investigator went on. Messages had been recovered. Deleted texts between Karen and someone saved under a first name only. Conversations that didn't mention me directly but didn't need to. Complaints about being trapped, about needing freedom, about plans that would be easier if certain problems disappeared. The word problem echoed in my head. There's also evidence of an affair, the investigator said gently. That one landed differently. Not because it surprised me, but because of who it would hurt. My first thought wasn't anger. It was Michael. I pictured my son sitting somewhere alone, replaying the footage, replaying his own words, now learning that while he was defending his wife, she had already been stepping outside their marriage. The betrayal stacked on betrayal felt almost cruel in its precision. "He doesn't know yet," I said quietly. "He will," she replied, as part of the process. After the call ended, I sat there for a long time, my hands resting flat on the table, my breathing slow and measured. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt tired in a way sleep couldn't touch. This wasn't revenge. This was collapse. Michael reached out that evening, not directly, but through the investigator. He wanted to know if I was okay. He wanted to talk. He wanted to apologize in person. I wasn't ready. For the first time in my life, I didn't rush to ease his discomfort. I didn't soften the truth or excuse his behavior. I let the silence stand. I needed space to understand what had happened, not just to me, but inside me. When I thought about the house now, it didn't feel like home. It felt like a stage where I'd played a role without realizing the script had been written against me. Returning there, even temporarily, felt impossible. That night, I called my sister in Arizona. She answered on the second ring, her voice instantly concerned. "Eli, what's wrong?" I told her everything, not in detail, not with anger, just the facts. The storm, the accusation, the hospital, the investigation. There was a long silence on the line. Then she said, "You're coming here." It wasn't a question. "I don't want to be a burden," I said out of habit. She cut me off gently. "Don't start that," she said. "You're my brother." Something in my chest loosened. We talked logistics, flights, recovery, how long I might stay. For the first time since the storm, I was making decisions for myself instead of reacting to someone else's. The investigator confirmed the next morning that formal charges were being prepared. False reporting, fraud-related offenses. The words felt abstract, like something happening to strangers in a story I'd overheard. Karen had tried to explain herself, apparently. Stress, fear, feeling cornered. None of it changed the facts. Michael finally called me himself that afternoon. I let it ring once, twice. Then I answered. "Dad," he said, his voice breaking immediately. "I'm so sorry. I didn't speak. I saw everything," he continued. "The footage? The messages? I don't know how I didn't see it before. I should have listened to you. I should have checked. I raised a hand even though he couldn't see it. "Stop," I said quietly. He fell silent. "I'm not ready to talk about forgiveness," I said. "I'm still trying to understand what happened." "I understand," he said quickly. "I'll do whatever you want. Come back, please. It's your home." "It's not," I replied, surprised by how certain I sounded. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Dad, I'm not coming back," I said. "Not now. Maybe not ever." He didn't argue. That told me more than any apology could have. After the call, I packed what little I had. A few clothes, my medications. The framed photo of my wife I'd brought with me when I moved in. I held it for a long moment, tracing the edge with my thumb, then placed it carefully in my bag. I wasn't running away. I was choosing where to heal. As the days passed, the details continued to surface. More messages, more proof. Karen's story collapsed under the weight of its own planning. Each new revelation felt less shocking than the last, like watching a building fall after the first beam gives way. I felt strangely calm through it all. There was power in no longer needing to convince anyone. In knowing the truth existed independently of belief. In understanding that silence, once a shield I'd relied on, had nearly cost me my life. The night before my flight to Arizona, Michael sent one last message. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know I'm ashamed. And I love you." I read it carefully. Then I set the phone down. Love didn't erase what had happened. It didn't rewind the storm or unlock the door or warm my hands as I walked through the cold, but it mattered. Even broken, it mattered. As I turned out the light, one thought stayed with me, clear and steady. Karen had built her lie carefully, believing control would protect her. She never expected the truth to have more patience than she did. And now that the truth was standing, everything she'd built around the lie was falling exactly as it should. The quiet that followed was louder than the storm had ever been. I was settled into my sister's guest room in Arizona by the time the news became official. The space was small, but warm sunlight spilling through the window each morning, dry air, easing my breathing in a way I hadn't realized I missed. There were no raised voices here, no footsteps stopping outside my door. No sense that I needed to apologize for existing. Still, the silence carried weight. It pressed in during the quiet hours when there was nothing left to distract me from what had happened. The investigator called in the early afternoon. I recognized her number immediately and answered without hesitation. "She's been charged," she said. There was no drama in her voice, no satisfaction, just fact. False reporting, fraud-related offenses. The words sounded clinical, stripped of emotion, but they carried consequences I understood, even if I didn't fully feel them yet. Karen's version of events had finally collapsed under the weight of evidence she never imagined would surface. I thanked the investigator and ended the call. Then I sat there for a long time, my hands folded in my lap, listening to the hum of the ceiling fan. I waited for relief to arrive. It didn't. What came instead was a strange, hollow calm. Justice hadn't felt like triumph. It felt like an ending. Michael didn't take the news well. I didn't hear it from him directly at first. I heard it through the investigator, through a few careful sentences meant to convey concern without intruding. He was shaken, isolated, barely sleeping. He replayed the night over and over, according to her, stuck on the sound of his own voice telling me to get out. I knew that sound too well. His first message arrived that evening. It was short, nothing like the speeches he'd tried to give me earlier. "Dad, I don't know how to live with what I did." I read it twice, 3 times. Then I set the phone down without replying. For years, my instinct would have been to reassure him, to tell him it was okay to absorb his guilt so he wouldn't have to carry it alone. That instinct rose up now, familiar and strong. But something else rose with it, quieter but steadier. Boundaries. The next day, another message came. Longer this time. He apologized again, more thoroughly, naming his mistakes, admitting his blindness, his failure to ask questions. He said he understood if I never wanted to see him again. I believed him, and that made it harder. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I focused on the small rituals of healing, physical therapy exercises that left my knees sore but improving. Short walks in the dry Arizona sun, my cane tapping against the sidewalk, meals eaten at a table where no one watched me with calculation. My sister never hovered. She simply existed beside me, steady and unassuming. That steadiness mattered more than I could explain. Karen attempted to justify herself once through her attorney. Stress, fear, feeling trapped. I was told about it in careful professional language, as if cushioning the impact might make it easier to hear. It didn't move me. Those explanations might have mattered before the footage, before the messages, before the research into how to remove me from my own life. Now they sounded like noise. I chose not to see her, not in person, not on a screen. I didn't need to confront her to feel resolved. Distance was enough. Accountability had arrived without my participation, and that felt important. Michael called again a few days later. This time I answered. "Dad," he said, his voice hoarse. "I'm not calling to ask you to come back. I know that's not right. I need to say this out loud." I said nothing, letting him continue. "I failed you," he said. "I failed to protect you. I chose convenience over truth. And I'm going to live with that for the rest of my life." The words hung in the air between us. "I don't know what you want from me," he added, "but I want to earn whatever comes next. If that's nothing, I'll accept it." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of everything we'd been through. "I'm not coming back," I said. "Not now, maybe not ever." "I understand," he replied immediately. No argument, no bargaining, just acceptance. "I need time," I continued. "Time where my life isn't defined by that house or that night." "I'll give you all the time you need," he said. When the call ended, I felt drained but oddly lighter. Saying it out loud had solidified something inside me. I wasn't running away. I was choosing myself. As the legal process moved forward, details trickled out that I didn't seek but couldn't avoid. Court dates scheduled, conditions set, the house sold. Karen moved out. The life she'd tried to manipulate unraveled piece by piece, not with spectacle but with inevitability. I packed slowly, even though I wasn't leaving again anytime soon. It wasn't about moving. It was about deciding what stayed with me and what didn't. Old papers I no longer needed. Clothes that belonged to a version of myself that no longer fit. I kept only what felt true. One afternoon, as I was sorting through a small box of photographs, my phone buzzed again. It was Michael. I hesitated, then answered. "I don't want to rush you," he said, "but if there's ever a time you'd consider seeing me, even just for coffee, I'd be grateful." The request was careful, respectful. It didn't demand forgiveness or assume access. "I'm not ready yet," I said. "I know," he replied. "I just wanted you to know the door is open. Not like before. On your terms." That mattered. That night, lying in bed, I thought about how easily everything had collapsed once the truth entered the room. How fragile control had been, how quickly manipulation lost its power when exposed. I thought about the version of myself that had believed endurance was the same thing as dignity. It wasn't. Dignity, I realized, came from knowing when to stay and when to leave. From understanding that protecting others at the cost of your own safety wasn't noble. It was dangerous. I slept better than I had in months. The next morning, sunlight streamed across the floor, warm and forgiving. My knee still ached. My arm still bore faint traces of bruises that would eventually fade. Some wounds would take longer than others. But as I stood there, leaning on my cane, breathing in the quiet, I knew one thing for certain. Everything that needed to collapse had collapsed. What came next would be built slowly, carefully, on truth instead of fear. Arizona felt like a different world. The air was dry and warm, even in the mornings, and the light came in soft through the curtains instead of sharp and gray. I woke up without the sound of wind rattling windows or footsteps pausing outside my door. My sister's house didn't smell like tension or fear. It smelled like coffee and dust, and something familiar I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Peace. My body was still healing. My knee ached when I stood too long. My right hand still lagged behind my thoughts some days. But I was stronger than I had been when I arrived, stronger than I'd been that night in the storm. Physical therapy helped, but so did something less visible. I wasn't shrinking anymore. In the quiet moments, I took stock of what I'd lost. The idea of a home I thought was safe. The belief that love alone was enough to protect you. The comfort of trusting without question. Those things were gone, and pretending otherwise would have been another kind of lie. But not everything had been taken from me. I still had my name, my voice, my ability to choose what I would accept and what I would not. I had survived the cold, the accusation, the silence. I had lived long enough to see the truth stand on its own. That mattered. Time changed the shape of the pain. It didn't erase it, but it dulled the sharp edges. The night of the storm stopped replaying itself every time I closed my eyes. Michael's words still echoed sometimes, but they no longer defined me. I stopped asking myself what I could have done differently and started asking a better question. What do I need now? The answer wasn't dramatic. It was small and steady. Routine, respect, boundaries. Michael reached out again after several months had passed. This time, there was no urgency in his message, no desperation, just an update. He was in counseling. He had sold the house. He was learning how to sit with guilt instead of running from it. I read his words carefully. Then I called him. Our first conversation after everything had happened was quiet and awkward. There were long pauses. He didn't rush to fill them. He apologized again, but this this time without expecting a response that would make him feel better. He listened when I spoke. He didn't interrupt. He didn't defend himself. That was new. We met in person weeks later in a small cafe near my sister's house. Neutral ground. No walls filled with memories. He looked older than I remembered, thinner somehow. When he saw me, he didn't reach out. He waited. I sat across from him and told him the truth. Not just about the storm, but about the years of silence that came before it. About how often I had swallowed discomfort to keep the peace. About how being dismissed hurts more than being shouted at. He cried. Not loudly. Not performatively. Just quietly, like a man who finally understood the cost of what he'd done. I didn't forgive him that day. Not fully. Forgiveness, I learned, isn't a switch you flip. It's a process. A choice you make again and again with boundaries in place. But I didn't walk away either. Love doesn't disappear just because trust is broken. It changes. It slows down. It demands proof instead of promises. Karen never contacted me directly. I heard updates only when necessary, filtered through legal channels, stripped of emotion. She had tried to explain herself to justify what she'd done. Stress, fear, feeling trapped. Those explanations might have worked once. They didn't anymore. I no longer needed her to understand my pain for it to be real. As the months passed, I found myself thinking less about revenge and more about clarity. The storm hadn't given me justice in the way movies promise. There was no triumphant confrontation, no dramatic speech. What it gave me instead was something quieter and far more valuable. Perspective. I saw how easily kindness can be mistaken for weakness, how silence can look like consent, how quickly people will believe a lie if it's delivered with confidence and fear. I also saw how fragile manipulation becomes when exposed to patience and evidence. The truth doesn't rush. It waits. One afternoon, sitting on the back porch with a cup of coffee warming my hands, I realized something that surprised me. I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a man who had been tested and had survived with his dignity intact. That night in the storm didn't end my life. It redirected it. I didn't go back to who I was before. I didn't want to. That version of me believed endurance was the same as love. That staying quiet kept everyone safe. I know better now. Kindness is not weakness, and silence is not protection. If you're listening into this and something in my story feels familiar, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not wrong for speaking up. You are not selfish for protecting yourself. And you are not obligated to suffer quietly just to keep other people comfortable. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is tell the truth and step away. If you've ever been blamed for something you didn't do or stayed silent to protect someone who hurt you, you're not alone. I'd like to hear your story. Share it in the comments if you feel comfortable. You never know who might need to read it. And if stories like this matter to you, if you believe that dignity, truth, and quiet justice deserve a place to be heard, consider staying here with me. Subscribe to the channel and walk with us through more real stories about resilience, accountability, and the strength it takes to reclaim your life. Thank you for listening.